Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky just told the world a secret. For the first time since Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation in Ukraine began back in February 2022, Zelensky has revealed a pair of numbers everybody has been waiting to hear. How many Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have died or been injured in the conflict? He touched on both topics in the past, but we never had an official confirmation of both numbers from either the Ukrainian or Russian sides before. Now we do. And they demonstrate just how shocking Russia's losses are compared to Ukraine's. Zelensky's figures show us that more than 4 Russian soldiers are dying for every 1 Ukrainian fighter, highlighting just how badly Putin has failed to make his numbers advantage count in Ukraine. That brings us to some questions. Just how many Russian soldiers have died compared to Ukrainian ones? And why is Russia's death count so much higher than Ukraine's, given the size and supposed strength of its military? We answer both questions in this video, starting with Zelensky's numbers. On December 8, 2024, Zelensky published a post to the social media platform Telegram. In it, he claimed that 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died since February 2022, with a further 370,000 being wounded. It's Zelensky's first full official disclosure of Ukraine's casualty rate, and it shows us just how draining Putin's special military operation has been on the country. Zelensky had hinted at Ukraine's casualty rate before. In February 2024, he told us that 31,000 Ukrainians had died on the battlefield, though he refused to give the number of wounded during that announcement. From that, we can deduce that Ukraine has lost 12,000 of its troops to death over the last 8 months, giving it a rough death rate of around 1,500 soldiers per month. Back in February, Zelensky told the world that he didn't want to deliver too much information to the Kremlin. Now he appears to have changed his tune. And one of the reasons may be that for as draining as the war has been for Ukraine, it's been utterly devastating for Russia. Zelensky also noted that Russia has lost far more of its people than Ukraine. Updated data on Russian losses exceeds 750,000 of their people, Ukraine's president said. This is 198,000 Russians killed and more than 550,000 wounded. It's also 198,000 dead Russians to 43,000 dead Ukrainians, giving us a ratio of just over 4.6 to 1. It gets even worse for Russia. When revealing the numbers, Zelensky was quick to point out that many of Ukraine's injured and wounded recovered and made it back to the battlefield. The 370,000 wounded figure he shared for Ukraine takes into account that in our army, approximately 50% of the wounded return to service, and all injuries are recorded, including minor and repeated ones. In other words, Ukraine's figures are as accurate as they could possibly be, claims Zelensky, even stretching as far as to include injury statistics for those who've been hurt in minor ways that don't prevent them from continuing to fight. These comments could be seen as Zelensky's way of casting doubt on any death or casualty figures Russia releases, with the implication being that Russia may well color its casualty numbers by not recording minor injuries or not counting fighters who got hurt and then returned to the battlefield as casualties at all. Still, the headline here is over 4.6 to 1, 198,000 dead Russians to 43,000 dead Ukrainians. It's worth noting at this point that Zelensky's figures are unverified, at least by the BBC, though they seem to align with estimates provided by Western officials. The BBC says unnamed Western officials put Russia's casualty rate at around 800,000, which roughly aligns with the exceeds 750,000 figure that Zelensky shared. Other sources suggest the Ukrainian death figure may be higher than 43,000. The New York Times says the figure differs sharply from estimates released by several military analysts and US officials, who put the number as being closer to 70,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers back in August 2023. And of course, the Kremlin has disputed any figures that Zelensky shares, with a statement released in the wake of the Ukrainian president's post claiming that Ukrainian losses were many times higher than Russian losses. That seems unlikely, especially if the 198,000 dead figure is accurate. Many times higher would mean that Ukraine has at least 396,000 dead if many times translates to 2 times higher. Presumably Russia means more than that, which would have Ukraine's death total approaching 1 million. Again, that's unlikely. There's no way that Ukraine would have managed to maintain its brave defense against Russia if so many of its soldiers were dying. It wouldn't have an army left. Of course, the Kremlin may also mean that its death and casualty figures are far lower than Ukraine claims, but that ignores all of the evidence being put forth by Ukraine and its Western partners. Either way, there's some debate about the figures, but it's likely that Zelensky is far closer to the real numbers than the Kremlin. And so we come to another question. Why has Zelensky chosen now to share the figures? Part of the reason comes down to US President-elect Donald Trump. It's notable that Zelensky's statement came just a couple of hours after Trump claimed that Ukraine had lost around 400,000 soldiers, though the future president didn't specify how many of those were killed versus wounded. If we return to Zelensky's figures, his number of 43,000 dead and 370,000 wounded align with Trump's statement. Ukraine's president likely threw in the information about how detailed Kyiv's injury recording is and how many of its wounded soldiers returned to the field to soften Trump's number, showing that Ukraine's losses aren't quite as severe as Trump made them appear. It's also worth noting that Trump said that Ukraine has lost many more civilians to Putin's aggression. According to Statista, current numbers of Ukrainian civilian casualties stand somewhere around 12,162 killed and 26,919 wounded as of November 2024. Those are verified casualty figures, and it's possible that there are more unverified civilian deaths and injuries to add to these numbers. So Zelensky likely made his announcement in part both to clarify Trump's figures and because Trump's post had let the cat out of the bag. But there's another possible reason: peace. In his Truth Social post, Trump also said Zelensky and Ukraine would like to make a deal and stop the madness, when prefacing his sharing of the Ukrainian casualty rate. There should be an immediate ceasefire and negotiations should begin, Trump raged. Too many lives are being so needlessly wasted, too many families destroyed, and if it keeps going, it can turn into something much bigger and far worse. Zelensky would like to make a deal. That opinion is backed by Zelensky himself, who told the Japanese Kyodo news agency on December 1st that Ukraine's army currently lacks the strength to push Russia beyond its country's borders. We do have to find diplomatic solutions, he told the outlet. But any peace plan would have to be fair to Ukraine, Zelensky said. If the conflict is frozen without any strong position for Ukraine, then Putin will come back in 2, 3, 5 years. He will come back and he will destroy us completely and utterly, Zelensky told Kyodo. To ensure that just peace, Ukraine has developed its own 10-point peace plan, which stands alongside its 5-point victory plan, in which it covers the issues that would concern it if a ceasefire were to be announced. The peace plan includes removing Russia's ability to blackmail the world with nuclear disaster, ensuring Ukrainian food and energy security, releasing prisoners and deportees back to Ukraine, and the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, amongst other points. This renewed dialogue around peace casts a different light on Zelensky, revealing the casualty figures. Yes, showing the world that Russia has lost over 4 times as many soldiers as Ukraine could be seen as Zelensky puffing out his chest. Ukraine has killed 198,000 soldiers versus Russia killing 43,000 Ukrainians, he appears to be telling the world. If the West continues to supply us with more arms and training, Ukraine could inflict even more damage on a depleted Russian military. That may be the case. But Zelensky's comments to Kyodo reveal that Ukraine is also suffering from depletion problems. It's been a long and hard war for Ukraine, with Russia's ability to constantly sacrifice more and more soldiers in the country, allowing it to slowly gain ground. So Zelensky may have also revealed these figures to the world because he truly believes it's time for peace. The figures are a wake-up call to Ukraine, Russia, and the West that this war has claimed close to 250,000 lives already and left nearly 1 million Russians and Ukrainians injured. It's far better to find a just peace now, especially with Trump coming into office in January, than it is to carry on killing, which may be the message Zelensky hopes to deliver with these figures. Zelensky may be sending a direct message to Putin with these figures. You are losing far too many troops and pieces of equipment in this war. Let's talk. And Russian losses have been staggering throughout the war. Back in December 2023, CNN published a piece in which it claimed that Russia had lost 87% of the soldiers it had before the start of Putin's special military operation. Again, the figures are muddy, as lost doesn't account for how many of these soldiers were dead versus those who had been wounded. But CNN also added that Russia had lost about 2/3 of its pre-war stock of tanks. The numbers, which came from a US intelligence assessment, claimed that Russia had lost 315,000 of the 360,000 soldiers that made up the country's pre-war ground force. With tanks, Russia had 3,500 before the war, but had lost 2,200. It also had a high infantry fighting vehicle loss rate, with Ukraine having destroyed or disabled 4,400 of Russia's 13,600, a 32% loss rate. This was back in December 2023. It's been an entire year since US intelligence released those figures, and Russia's losses have only grown more substantial. Assuming the 360,000 figure was the overall Russian casualty rate including death and injuries, Zelensky's figures reveal that Russia has more than doubled that casualty rate in the space of a year. That will be a wake-up call for Putin. Zelensky is telling him that Russia is losing too many of its people. A staggering 750,000 Russians are either dead or injured, thanks to the special military operation, and it's about time it all came to an end. But let's come back to the headline figures for a moment. There are 198,000 dead Russians to 43,000 dead Ukrainians in the war. Ukraine is out-killing Russia at a ratio of over 4-1, which brings us to an obvious question. Why? After all, Russia had a far more powerful military on paper when the war started. There's a reason why Russia's leader felt confident that he would take Kyiv within 5 days during the initial stage of the invasion. All of the numbers were drastically in his favor. Yet that 5-day coup didn't happen, and we're now nearing the 3-year point of the war. To figure out how Russia has lost so many soldiers compared to Ukraine, we need to dig into Russia's tactics and its approach to the conflict. We start with the big one, Putin's meat grinder approach to the fighting. When it became apparent that Ukraine was not only going to put up a stern resistance to his invading forces, but that it would do so with Western aid, Putin adjusted his approach. If Russia couldn't steamroll Ukraine, it would just throw thousands upon thousands of its soldiers into a meat grinder to wear the country's defenses down. As The Guardian put it in October 2024, the ends justify the means for Putin. Ill-advised and poorly planned assaults became the norm for Russia's ground forces. The Guardian piece highlights the story of a pair of Russian soldiers who told of their orders to advance to a new position at night through a minefield. It was a suicide mission, the soldiers claimed. 3 groups already went ahead and they aren't responding, and we were the 4th, claimed the soldiers in a video they published to social media. The pair also lambasted their commander, claimed he sent the hungry and freezing in droves to their deaths. Your insane orders are killing them. Russia's tactic of just sending soldiers into dangerous areas almost as cannon fodder for Ukraine's weapons likely accounts for the 198,000 dead that Zelensky claims. But it's a tactic that's working slowly. As the BBC highlighted on December 6th, Russian forces have managed to capture around 907 square miles of territory in eastern Ukraine and the western Kursk region toward the end of 2024. Those pushes against Ukrainian forces came at a massive cost. November 2024 saw the country suffer 45,680 casualties, amounting to a daily loss of 1,523 troops to death or injury during the month. November was capped with Russia's highest ever single-day casualty rate in the war, 2,030, on November 28th. When you understand these tactics, it becomes a little clearer why Russia has 198,000 dead to Ukraine's 43. That's been the plan since the initial failure of Putin's special military operation. When Putin realized that he couldn't use the country's massive numbers advantage to take Ukraine at will, he pivoted to using his numbers in another way. Soldier after soldier simply sent to death. Ukraine's defensive fortifications, mines, and weaponry allow it to kill far more Russian soldiers as they engage in their ill-planned death marches than Russians can kill Ukrainians. Yes, Russia eventually wears down the Ukrainian positions to the point where it can overwhelm them, but its losses are enormous in the process of doing so, and the reward, beyond small scraps of territory, are the deaths of far fewer Ukrainian soldiers than these Russian units lost in making their pushes. We touched on Russia's Eastern Front assault earlier. For much of 2024, Russia has made a concerted push to take territory in the Donbass, with a particular focus on Donetsk. And it's that push that likely contributes to the December 2023 casualty figures CNN shared, around 360,000 Russian soldiers being so different to the more than 750,000 casualties Zelensky claimed a mere year later. This Eastern Front push gives us another reason why Russia's death rate is over 4 times higher than Ukraine's. The Donbass has been a focus for Putin since the war's beginning, with 2024 bringing the renewed push into the region. The region is a past Soviet industrial heartland, with one of Russia's goals since the beginning of the war being to liberate that heartland and return it to Russia. Putin's reasoning is that Ukraine's east is largely Russian-speaking. He's also made claims as far back as 2022 that Ukraine has committed genocide in the region. Those claims are unsubstantiated. The BBC also says that the region was home to mini-Russian statelets before Putin started the Ukraine war. Perhaps it's here where he sources his genocide claims. Since 2014, Ukraine's fighting against these statelets has led to the deaths of around 14,000 people, though 75% of those deaths were of pro-Russian fighters. The region's major cities of Donetsk and Luhansk were still primarily Ukrainian, even with their Russian influence. Still, Putin intends to annex the Donbass much as he did Crimea in 2014, because he appears to truly believe that the Russian-speaking population in the region wants to be part of the Russian Federation. That explains his focus on the Eastern Front and, in turn, the sheer number of deaths Russia has experienced fighting against Ukraine to claim the Donbass. When you throw Kursk into the mix, which Ukraine successfully invaded and is currently defending itself against a 50,000-strong Russian counteroffensive, you get a recipe for death. Putin wants to claim those 2 territories, or reclaim in Kursk's case, but he's already established that he doesn't have much tactical nous beyond relying on his meat grinder tactics, meaning every day of fighting on the Eastern Front is another day where Putin sacrifices soldiers to achieve his goals. Again, more Russian deaths are the result. So the meat grinder, combined with Putin's focus on a specific region of Ukraine, goes some way to explaining how Russia has lost 198,000 soldiers to Ukraine's 43,000. Russia is the attacking force. Its troops are trying to batter down well-fortified Ukrainian positions, which gives Ukraine more than enough opportunities to pick Russian soldiers off with drones, artillery, and whatever weapons they have at their disposal. For Putin, sending wave after wave of soldiers to deplete Ukraine's ammunition is the primary tactic, even if those soldiers are cold, hungry, and wholly unprepared for fighting against Ukraine. And therein we find another reason for Russia's death count being so much higher than Ukraine's. So much of what it does in Ukraine is poor. Terrible leadership, a lack of proper training, and massive equipment issues have all contributed to Russia's losses. That much was clear back in May 2023, with the Russian losses at that point having damaged the organizational integrity of Russia's armed forces. That's according to Russian political analyst Pavel Lutsin, who says that the first year or so of the war saw Russia lose not only soldiers, but many of its most experienced officers on the battlefield. Russia lost a generation of officers, especially if we speak about bottom-level officers like lieutenants and captains, Lutsin told Newsweek. He added that most of those veterans, those leaders, were lost in the first 6 months of the war. Don't underestimate the impact that this has had on Russia in more recent times. The loss of these officers also means the loss of the tactical and strategic knowledge they possessed. Not having them anymore means Russia is forced to promote poorly trained and inexperienced soldiers into roles for which they're not ready. That's how you end up with situations like commanders telling their soldiers to run through a minefield at night to get to a new position, as revealed in the Guardian story we shared earlier. And when you combine that on-the-ground tactical ineptitude with Putin's one-note strategy, you get the meat grinder to which we've referred so often. Death after death is acceptable to Putin because it doesn't matter what happens to his soldiers on the ground as long as they are slowly gaining territory. Perhaps that's why Russia is investing so little into training its soldiers. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War said in September 2024, "I find myself being surprised with the new depths of how poor the Russian individual soldier quality is," when referring to troop capabilities on the ground. With each new generation of Russian soldier comes a progressive worsening, as Russia is rushing its soldiers into battle rather than taking the time to train them properly. "It's becoming really difficult for me to see what other additional shortcuts they could take, other than maybe deploying people just unfit for the service," Barros added, before saying the bar for entering the Russian military is very, very low at this point. And that brings us right back to Zelensky's headline figures: 198,000 dead Russian soldiers versus 43,000 Ukrainians. Yes, the more than 4-to-1 ratio exists because Ukraine has displayed brilliant tactics and has benefited immensely from Western support, giving it access to superior weapons. But there wouldn't be as many dead Russian soldiers were it not for Putin's meat grinder tactics combined with the loss of experienced officers and the terrible training Russia's newer soldiers have undergone. Russia has 198,000 dead soldiers because Putin's entire approach to the Ukraine war after the failure of his initial push for Kyiv has necessitated the loss of so many soldiers. Perhaps with the numbers laid so bare, Russia's leader may finally see a reason to come to the negotiating table for peace talks. But what do you think about Zelensky's revelation? Does it make sense that Russia has lost so many soldiers compared to Ukraine? Will having lost over 4 times more troops than Ukraine be enough to make Putin consider peace? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, and thank you, as always, for watching.